third installment of Theory Chats, an interactive companion to the 2024 book, The Theory Story Reader for Social Studies, published with Teachers College Press. We hope this abbreviated conversation, and the ones that are to follow, will pique people's interest in how the book approaches stories and applies theory to social studies education. If it happens to do so, the volume is available at all major online retailers or by going directly to tcpress.com and searching for the title. Brett and I are also more than happy to answer any questions related to the project, so please feel free to contact us. Today's guest is Dr. Stacey Kerr, who will be talking about mobilities, which is highlighted in her chapter.
Thanks so much for joining us today. And would you mind introducing yourself? And then perhaps you can start by telling us a little bit about how you arrive or depart to and from theory in your research and or your teaching or your academic endeavors.
Great. Hi. Yeah. So I'm Stacey Kerr. I am currently on a leave of absence. So I was previously worked as an assistant principal, as a professor, and now I'm spending some time at home with my 2-year-old son. And I want to talk a bit about my mobilities chapter today. And how did I come to this? Okay. So before I began my PhD in social studies and teacher education, I was trained in research methods in geography and GIS. So this concept of space has been something that's been really central to my work since then. Early on in my master's program, I encountered mobilities theories, and they just immediately clicked for me. Mobilities offers this incredible framework. It's both intuitive and complex, and it's for interpreting how people, goods, ideas, values, cultures, all of these things are moving and how these movements shape the world that we inhabit. So at its core, mobilities theories, really, they challenge us to reconsider how space is constituted. It's not just this static thing, but it's something that we are constantly involved in making and remaking. And so our lived realities are not occurring within predetermined spaces. We're part of that production. And so when I came into education research and was teaching more, I brought that perspective with me. And I began exploring what mobilities and space could offer to discussions about education. And I think this is especially important when so much of our lives now have moved online, this more of intangible type of space. And mobilities gives us an opportunity to make sense of how spaces can extend beyond the walls of a classroom or the boundaries of a school district. And these intangible spaces are just as real as those tangible ones, and they have just as much of an impact. So being able to think about that and think with that is something that's really exciting to me. And so mobilities really is this lens that I use to look at educational spaces and spaces of teacher education. And so those spaces include the physical classroom, but also things like social media. Like, what are teachers saying and doing with each other online? And how does the space that gets constructed through those meetings have an impact on what is happening in the educational world? And so I think it's just really important with this perspective that these flows of people, of goods, of information, and then also other intangible things like gender, class, personal economics, that all these things are always acting and always creating and recreating spaces as we exist within them.
Wonderful, thank you. You talked a lot about mobilities and how you got interested in it and how you use it in education. Could you talk a little bit about how mobilities relates to social studies?
So mobilities, I think, gives us a way that we can look at how the often discrete disciplines of social studies actually are always already intertwined. And so, Erin, that's something that you and I have worked on previously, and that's something that I touch on in the chapter. But mobilities allows me to see and to help my students see how the flows and the connections of these disciplines are always acting on each other. So geography has a history. History has a geography. And economic forces and political movements are then like always working on those things too. And we could think of a million other combinations of how they're working together. They're not in these neatly formed categories. And mobilities is some way that helps me see these intersections within social studies more clearly, and then helps me guide my students to see them too. So the theory shows that these intertwined facets of the world, they don't just coexist, but that they're actively shaping each other. And so to me, geography is not just about where things happen, it's about understanding how the movement of things makes other things possible. So how people, goods, ideas, values, all these things I've mentioned before, they flow through space and time to produce the world that we live in today. So in the classroom, mobilities to me offers a way to break down some of those barriers that we've created as a field and to show students that understanding and maybe a deeper understanding of the world in the classroom, but also the world at large, requires us to look beyond some of those boundaries.
That was wonderful. I love the framing of flows and thinking about bodies in space and more than human bodies in space, which I think is a great little segue here to our next question, which I think you touched upon a little bit, but perhaps you can give maybe a few other examples. And the question is, as our book is inspired by Deleuze's suggestion of being on the lookout, what are some ways that theory reveals itself to you in your own life outside of the classroom or spaces where you conduct research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in reading Deleuze in grad school, I've been someone that's always on the lookout for theory in my everyday life. And part of my dissertation and then my research after that has really been interested in these everyday spaces, not the super special or, something that feels out there and wild, but just like almost the boring, banal, just everyday spaces and how important those are. And I think that they're especially important in education. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm currently on a leave of absence to be home with my son, just about 2 years old. And what I've been thinking about a lot lately is how much theory I see in the rhythm of my day-to-day life, even though that life looks very different than when I was in a university or a K to 12 setting. So, if anything, this stage of life has really brought into sharp focus an aspect of mobilities that's often overlooked and something that I myself have overlooked in my own work. And this idea of a lack of movement or a stillness or a lingering. So, I used to maybe more predominantly think of mobility as more of this active, dynamic, always moving. But I've come to see that this stillness or this lingering is also a form of movement and one that is just as important. And it has just as much of an impact to create and recreate spaces as these more dynamic ones. So I was thinking of examples and the other day I was on a walk with my son. We were headed to the park. And as toddlers do, he suddenly just plopped down into a squat in the middle of the sidewalk to look at a cluster of flowers in someone's front yard. And to him, he wasn't just looking at them. He was like totally absorbed. He's pointing at the flowers. He's looking at me. He can't get enough of this. And it was one of those moments where I was like, okay, if I had been alone, I might have been like, oh, nice garden, and then just kind of kept on going, really intentional about getting from point A to point B. But his pace and his stopping, his lingering really forced me to engage, to think about the space, and to just be in it in a different way than I would have been otherwise and without him there. And so for me, this is where the theory comes in. So his lingering, or what I like to call the toddler linger, actually reconstituted the space of the sidewalk around us. So he's sitting there, he's observing the flowers, and the woman who owns the house comes out. She smiles, she waves, and we ended up having a conversation. And this is a conversation that likely would have been impossible had my son not stopped to do this. And his simple act of pausing transformed what had always been to me just a passageway, just a route to get from one place to the other. And this created a space for him, for me, and for this woman to have this interaction. And from a social studies perspective, all of a sudden, all of these things came up that I was thinking, oh my gosh, if we were in a classroom, I could have used this everyday event to show how much geography, history, economics comes into play. Because the woman talked about her own son, her own family history, how important it was to cherish the young years. She talked about how she had intentionally planted this actual garden as a way for providing for her children. She talked about how she wasn't the primary wage earner in her family, and that was That was her form of giving to her family, or one of the forms that she gave to her family, her way of providing. She talked about mobility in a sense. She mentioned that her son had since moved away and that that movement had changed their relationship. So even though he was in a different place, they still were close, but it was different. So in my head, there's geography, there's history, there's economics, and then we've got all these other forces too. We've got issues of gender, we've got issues of class, power, race, class, all of these things that are just happening and enacting with each other in this simple moment. So, in a way, my son's act of mobility or lack of mobility made visible these layers of social, of economic, and historical forces that shaped and created this space that only existed in this moment. So, it's, boring event that was actually pretty cool when you start to use the theory to look at the different layers. So for me, theory is just something that can pop up in the most unexpected places when we're on the lookout for it. And yeah, I hope that that example kind of shares the one way that I'm using and thinking about mobilities theories in everyday life, in the classroom and whatnot.
I love it. Toddler mobilities. I feel like this is a new line of
A new
research. Here we
field.
go. This is
It's so
awesome.
amazing.
No,
Oh,
that's
I love that.
and definitely your son is he's so curious. He's always on like
Yes,
on the lookout. So I love it.
he is always on the lookout. That's true.
That was wonderful. So thank you so much for again for your wonderful contribution to the project and for being so generous with your time. We hope viewers and listeners today who wish to seek out the book will do so. And those who wish to know more about the ways that bodies negotiate space, and as Stacey said, creates flows and connections across multiple academic disciplines.
We also hope you'll check out the 3-Minute Theory video series created by Drs. Kerr, Beth Wurzburg, and our very own Aaron Adams. Until we chat again, thank you so much.
Thank you.